Okay, so let's talk about some more HTML, bunch of the different tags and so forth to kind of get a handle on all of this structure stuff. I mentioned last time a little bit about this notion of semantic HTML. With HTML5, when they developed it, the committee spent a lot of time looking at HTML out in the wild so that they could figure out what developers' intents were behind doing certain things, to see what tags might be missing. Okay, so one of the things I have here on is this HTML5 flowchart, which is just really great for helping you kind of get a sense of how to begin thinking about the content on your page and the overall structure, right? So you sort of start, okay, is it a major navigation block, right? You would use something like the Nav Tag. Nav is in fact new in HTML5, right? If it's not a navigation block, right, does it make sense on its own? For instance, right, and they mention here in a feed reader, right? If that's the case, then it's probably an article. Again, that's something new. If it isn't, is it required to understand the current content, right, et cetera, et cetera. So you can follow through this, you can read it, and so forth. But again, it's a really good guide for trying to figure out which particular tags to use and so forth. Okay, there we go. All right. So let's start playing around with some stuff. Here I have an empty directory. Let me go ahead and just create a quick folder. I'll call it more HTML. Right. The other thing that I want to spend a little bit more time on in this video is Emmet. Okay, so with brackets, I suggested that you install Emmet, and Emmet, I mentioned before, is not unique to brackets. Most modern editors have a plugin for Emmet, and it is incredibly helpful as a web developer. Okay, so a couple of things about all this, right? So there's the Emmet cheat sheet, and again, I'll put these if you're not in my class, you found this online. I'll put this in the show notes below. There's a couple of issues. So first of all, one is what you'll find in this class is we're going to spend a lot of time looking at code. We're going to look at HTML code. We're going to look at CSS code. We're going to look at JavaScript. We're going to look at other types of code, etc. There are tools out there that allow you to do a WYSIWYG style of web development. Okay, the reason that we're going to focus on the code, or one of the reasons, is that as IT professionals, you're going to need to actually understand the basics of HTML code. Part of the reason? Suppose something isn't working with one of those tools. Right? The tool doesn't seem to be generating the correct content. The content that it generates maybe is not playing well with your company's content management system, etc., etc. Something isn't working, right? So in that case, you're probably going to need to dive down into the code. A lot of times also when we're working on server-side development, we will be writing programs that themselves generate HTML code. And so again, having an understanding of that HTML code is incredibly important. Now, having said that, the drawback is that it can require more effort in terms of development and so forth. So that's where something like Emmet comes in, right? Like I mentioned last time, one of the first shortcuts you should know is this one, right? So exclamation mark, I hit tab, boom, it puts in the HTML5 boilerplate for us. And so once we have our boilerplate, then we can start filling out everything. So more HTML. Let's see. So we can do an H1. Remember, in Emmet, we can type out the tag. We can just hit a tab, and that should complete that for us. So we could have more HTML. Right. So there's that. one of the things I'll point out, there is this this kind of live preview thing for brackets, which they claim is experimental or something, but sometimes it does actually seem to work. Right there, it is, shows us what that's going to look, or what that does look like. So let's talk about some of these different parts, some of the other things, stuff that we can do, and so forth. Let's we'll start with a couple of things, right? So generally speaking, right, and again, if you refer back to the H1 stuff and so forth, typically H1 is unique on the page unless it's sort of buried within other kinds of elements. And again, you can kind of take a look at that and so forth. But generally, you think of it as sort of the top level, or the most important level of your outline or hierarchy. Then we can have, for instance, other stuff. So I can have, things like content, and so there notice we have an H2, which is a slightly less important header. Again, like we talked about before. Yes, they look different, but these headers are not presentational, right? It is about structure. It is about conveying a particular intent, namely that here content is the sort of second level of our outline. Why does it look different? Well, because the browsers have default rules for a number of these tags, and so that's why we actually see this rendering. When we talk about CSS, we'll talk more about presentation and so forth. But I really just want to drive that home, that HTML is about the structure. All right, so a couple of things. Yes, we've seen paragraphs, right? We can have things like according to. You may have seen the video that I posted, where Pete Holmes talks about that as we I'll write it here. So we can have a block quote. Google has ruined wonder. Right? Oops, sorry. And so there is that. Yeah, notice, looks like it's already broke. There we go. Yes. Okay, so a block quote, you'll notice, is sort of pulled out from, right? So it is a block level element. Notice it gets pulled out again by in terms of the default rendering and so forth. Another tag that is pretty common. So we do have things like I for italics. Again, that's an older style tag that was introduced earlier in HTML before we kind of knew better. These days, what you tend to see is more something like this. So, for instance, we have the EM tag, which stands for emphasis, right? And again, so when we render this, we'll see. Oops, sorry. When we view this, we'll see, yes, typically the default rendering is in italics, but again, this idea of emphasis added, add emphasis to this. It is about structure. And again, when we talk about CSS, we'll see that we can, in fact, that we can change how that emphasis is added. Okay. Let's look at some other stuff. So, yes, we have H1. How about pre-formatted text? Now we kind of hit on this previously, or sort of hinted at it previously. Let me see. There we go. Looked like it was kind of getting screwed up. All right. So we kind of hinted at this previously when we talked about things like this, right? So here is unstructured text. Here is another line, etc. Right, so when I have that, you'll notice actually, as we talked about last time, it all appears on the same line. Sometimes it's the case that that you want actually to embed the literal formatting into something, and so the way that you can do that is to use the appropriate tag, namely the pre-tag. Okay, so the pre-tag. I'm going to go ahead and delete these. Okay. So pre-tag kind of looks just like this. Says pre, and then I can do things like line 1, and then I can do line 2, line 3, etc. Let me go ahead and save that, and there it is. Now, notice a couple of things there, right? So I did in fact get each of these on separate lines. Now, why are these way over? Well, they're way over because as I was typing this, notice it actually put in it automatically indented for me, so that technically, if I really want them unindented, this is really what I would want that to look like. Okay. Also, you may or may not be able to see, but typically browsers kind of change the font a bit for that to a sort of monospace type font. Pre is used a lot for showing things like code samples and stuff like that, stuff where you do generally want things formatted. All right, let's talk about lists. Okay, so again, there we go. We'll load this up. There are a couple of different styles of lists in HTML. First of all, let's talk about an unordered list. So the unordered list, you've undoubtedly seen these things before, looks like the following. So notice I could actually kind of type this out, first of all, saying UL and so forth and all of that. So we could certainly do that. But what I'm going to show you is a couple of things. So for instance, well, I'll start off there. So suppose that in HTML, right? So the li is the tag that is used for a list item. Okay, so for instance, I could say something like item 1. And so if I save that, there it is, right? So you'll notice unordered lists basically just have this little bullet. And there's ways that you can customize that and so forth. Suppose I actually wanted several of these things. In Emmet, I can do something like this. I could say, oh, okay, give me, let's say, 4 of those. And now when I hit tab, notice I have 4 elements. And then I kind of can fill these things out. I can say, okay, this is item 1, and this is item 2, etc. Right? So I could actually fill all those out. But in fact, I can actually get even farther. So let's see if I can remember how to do this. Should be li times 4. Is it item $, I believe? Yeah, there we are. Okay. So, the curly braces basically indicate what's going to be inside the LIs. The $sign is going to automatically get expanded out as a counter variable, right? So since I want 4 of these, we're going to start counting at 1 and go on from there, right? So that's actually the multiplication basically just means, do these things that many times. So now when I hit tab in Emmet, notice it actually expands out to item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4. Again, really, really helpful, right? I cannot stress this enough. Whether you're using brackets, whatever your tool is that you're going to use as a developer, spend the time to learn that tool. Understand how to use your tool to its utmost, right? And so this is an example of that. All right, so that's the unordered list. Okay, what about ordered lists? Well, ordered lists are exactly the same but different. Okay, so an ordered list is basically OL as opposed to the UL. I think I can actually do it this way. Let's see. So LI. Nope. Probably that. There it is. Yes. Okay, so OL, then basically descend in, we're going to have our line items, and we will have, again, we're labeling them such, and we're having 4, actually, we don't have to have 4, it doesn't always have to be 4, so there. Okay, there's 5 of them, and so when we load that up, notice our ordered list is in fact numbered. Okay, and again, you can actually change the format of this. You can have it lettered and so forth, all of those kinds of things. I'm not going to really spend a whole lot of time talking too much about that. I do want to actually I do want to talk about the fact that you can actually nest lists inside of other lists. So, for instance, I can actually do something like this. I could have an unordered list inside this list element, where, and let's just say it's a sub-item. Okay, so doing that looks something like that, right? And again, so you can see what the general structure for all of this basically is. So there's some general notions there. Now that we're starting to get some real content on the page, it's probably a good time to kind of talk about some other things as well. Back over here, right? I mentioned briefly this Nav Tag. Okay, so let's actually talk about that. So, as I mentioned before, the Nav Tag is new in HTML5, and basically it was one of those tags that the committee found was an intent that was lacking in previous versions of HTML5. So web developers were kind of coding around it using various other kinds of techniques, some things that we'll actually see a little bit later in this video. So here's kind of what nav looks like and how that gets added in and so forth, right? So for instance, I'm going to say, all right, here is my navigation section of my page, right? And just so we can kind of see, all right, I can have something like an H2 that I can call it navigation, all right? And so there it is. The point that I want to show is, honestly, whether I have nav here or not, doesn't make a difference, okay, in terms of presentation. But we put it because it's about using semantic tags, right? I stress again that what we're saying here is this particular section is for the site's navigation. Also, later on when we start talking about things like CSS and JavaScript, this is actually going to give us some handy little hooks for doing style, for doing styling and so forth, for that is unique or different to the navigation section versus other sections. Okay, so kind of ends up helping out. All right, so I can create, a lot of times you'll see these are simply unordered lists, and then we'll have we can have our various links and so forth. So I'm actually going to do it this way. So I'll say li, and it's going to be an a href, yeah, something like that. Okay, and let's say maybe we'll have like 3 or 4 of these things. Okay, like so. Oop, that's not quite. Yeah, so we can actually do that for grouping, and there we are. Okay. So, bunch of stuff in here. Again, we talked about the anchor tag before, right? So you've already seen that. That shouldn't be a big thing. And so, for instance, I can have things like I can actually have these map to my particular H2 headers, right? So we have the content section, we have the lists section, and I plan on having a couple of other sections that I just don't have listed here. Now, basically what I want to show is how we can then have links here to other parts on the page, right? Right now, you'll see they actually don't seem to go anywhere, right? Not only do they not seem to go anywhere, they literally don't go anywhere. What we can do, however, is to provide, is basically to say, look at, here is how you can actually navigate to a particular section. Okay, now there's a couple of ways of doing this. Honestly, one of the current preferred method is to add an ID attribute to the thing that you want to link to. Okay, so the ID attribute, and we're going to actually use this quite a bit. We're going to see this in CSS. We're going to see it in JavaScript and so forth. Really, really important. The idea behind the ID attribute is that only one thing on the page should have that particular ID. So in other words, here I've said, okay, this H2, this content header has the ID content. Okay, so I shouldn't have on the page another element that has ID equal to content. This provides kind of a little hook, one, so that we can actually link to that, like here. And the way that we do that is just like this. We put a £, and then whatever the ID is. I'm going to do the same thing for my list, right? So down here, I'm going to say the ID is lists, just like so. And then I'm going to come up to here, and we'll add in the link right there. Okay, so let's make sure that this stuff actually works. Now, in the case if I click content, you did see it, right? Notice it actually, the URL changes to whatever my page was, more.html, # content, right? And it actually jumped to there. Also, if I hit lists, you'll notice it actually kind of jumps down to list. Now, if you were paying close attention, you might say, well, wait a minute, content jumped right to the top of the page there. List didn't quite make it to the top of the page. Why? Well, because we ran out of page, right? So you notice there's nothing else beyond this. And so that's why we're seeing that the way that we are. Okay, so that's one of the ways. That's the recommended way that you're going to link to the document, to parts in the document itself. Okay, let's talk about some other stuff. So if I come down, let me kind of come down here. All right, there we go. There's this concept in web development that actually comes from the print industry, and it's called Lorem. Okay, it is in fact what people refer to oftentimes as Lorem ipsum text, and again, Emmet has the ability to generate Lorem text for us, right? So, for instance, let me do something like this. I'll say P, and I'll do Lorem times 4, something like, I didn't actually want spans. There we are. Okay. Now, if you take a look at this content, right, there it is. It looks like gibberish. It actually looks kind of Latin-y. It isn't actually Latin. It really is just nonsense. Okay. Now, why would anyone want to do this? Okay. There's actually good reason. And cognitive psychologists have in fact studied this. It turns out that if you're trying to work on the layout for a page or for a website, it's actually easier, it's more efficient if the content that you're laying out is nonsensical. Okay. In other words, basically, so if we use something like Lorem text when we're laying everything out, our brain, it makes it easier on our brains because our brain isn't trying to read all of this stuff to figure out what it means. Okay. So again, it's a little more efficient. It basically is it just kind of makes your life easier, and it's something that is built into brackets. It is something that you can certainly use as a technique, and you'll see used when people are trying to sort of just build some general build up the structure and perhaps the look of content without getting bogged down in the actual details of what is being displayed and so forth. Okay, and again, I'm going to add this into my menu as well, right? So there's Lorem. It's actually, let me do it this way, because I want to show something. I mean, the fact that I'm using IDs, right? In the previous IDs, the ID always matched whatever this content was. It doesn't have to, right? So here I'm just going to call it ipsum, and then I'll come over to here, and so we'll just make sure that has the ID ipsum, right? So now when I've reloaded this, right, there's Lorem, jumps down to that. Related to Lorem, let me actually show you one of my favorite. Emmet doesn't actually have this built in. I kind of wish it did, but Samuel. So if you really want to have some fun, you can use the Samuel L. Ipsum generator, which will generate content for that based on his character from I forget now. Anyways, you'll probably let me know in the comments below. Okay, so notice how many paragraphs, blah blah blah, generate it, right, and then there it is, right. So it kind of generates a bunch of stuff from right. There's the Pulp Fiction, that's the movie, right, and so it kind of generates all these various stuff, and again, kind of a little more quirky, fun, whatever you want to call it. Okay. So there's our Lorem text. There's all that stuff. We've talked about a lot of things. Let's talk about one more piece of HTML. Something that you need to be very, very careful with. Okay. Tables. Okay. So here's the thing. If you Google, if you depending on the source of, if you look online for web design tutorials and so forth, you may come across some older material that uses tables to do the overall layout of an HTML page. Okay, that is considered a very, very big no-no these days in modern web development. It's the kind of thing that honestly, if you use that, if you're doing the entire layout of your page using tables, chances are a lot of web shops are not going to hire you if they see you doing that. It's that much of a faux pas, so to speak. However, having said that, that doesn't mean that you can't use tables for anything. Tables are appropriate, and certainly the W3C documentation talks about tables being used for, well, as the name suggests, tabular content. If you have some content that itself generally lends to needing to be represented as a table, then by all means use a table to do it. But you shouldn't be using tables for the entire layout and structure. I'm sorry, layout and presentation of your web page itself. Okay. So let's take a look at how to use the table stuff. So I'll put my ID in there. Let's get this up here on the menu, or on our navigation. Oops, navigation section. Let's make sure that that's up there. Yep, tables. Click. Okay, there it is. Great. So with tables, of course, we have the table tag. Now, I'm gonna make a couple of mentions. As I said at the outset of this video, it is really, really important for you to understand the basics of HTML syntax and so forth. And certainly there are lots of WYSIWYG tools that are great. Adobe's Dreamweaver is one of them. It's kind of the standard in terms of use in our industry. Tables are one of those things where more often than not, I tend to grab one of those kinds of tools like Dreamweaver for actually creating the table. But nevertheless, I mean, we can still do it directly from the code. And well, yes, again, in this class, I'm going to kind of expect that you're able to do so. Okay, so let's take a look at this. And so we can say, for instance, so first of all, we have this notion of TR, which stands for table row. Okay. So our table rows then hold tabular data. Okay, so for instance, let's see, and I'll kind of build this all up here. So I'll have a TR where I'll have TDs, and let's say data that, and we're gonna do times 2. Let's do think. Okay. And that's not quite what I wanted. Let me see. There we are. Table row, table row, table row, etc. Okay. And again, you can kind of see how I had it generate that and so forth. Let's take a look at what that looks like, right? So there it is, data 01, data 02, data 01, data 02, etc. Okay, so it gives us we have this table where we have 4 rows and 2 columns for each of the rows. Now, it's not uncommon for tabular data to have some sort of row that represents basically the headers. So, for instance, I could have something like th. Okay. And again, you'll notice that by default, this in fact the header rows, the header data gets rendered differently. Okay, again, that's the default and so forth. But again, also the notion is that, we have this, we are using this, we are expressing the structure of our table and so forth. One other thing, it's not uncommon to add a caption to our table, right? So I could have something like here's and we can see there's how that is rendered by default. Okay, so there's our tabular data. Again, doesn't look the greatest, but it is certainly something that as we talk about styling and so forth, we'll look at making this look better. A couple of other things that I just want to sort of point out with tables. So it's not uncommon to, for instance, see a border displayed, right? So notice now here we have this really ugly looking border where actually we sort of have a double border around things and so forth. And again, when we talk about styling and all that, I'll show you how to get around that, how to kind of fix some of those things, so that if you do want borders and so forth, you don't have this weird kind of double border thing going on and all of that. Now, that gives you a pretty good overview of a lot of HTML. I mean, there's some other stuff in there. Again, if you look at the flow chart and so forth, you'll see some other elements and all of that. But you can certainly read up on that. I do want to talk about where to go if you don't actually have a tag, right? So, you'll notice you kind of start through here, you kind of try to figure out, okay, what kinds of things should I use and so forth. But ultimately, it might, right? So then you kind of get down to, does it have any semantics, right? Okay, so use that element. Maybe it's a paragraph, an address, a block quote, etc., right? What if it isn't? Okay. Notice they actually simply specify div, but there are in fact two different options. So let me actually show you that. I'm going to come here and I'm just going to create a quick new file. Let's call it span div HTML, and let's take a look at this. Okay, so in terms of rolling your own elements, basically you have 2 choices. Okay, so again, I'll just do that, span versus div. So our span and divs are the tags that the original developers or the developers of HTML give us when all the other tags have failed us. Okay, so when we don't have an appropriate semantic tag, but I need to mark something for a number of different reasons. Sometimes it's for styling purposes, sometimes it's for JavaScript purposes, etc. Then in that case, you're probably going to reach for a span or a div. Okay, so what's the difference? Why do we have these different things? Well, here, let me illustrate this. Okay, so here is a span tag. Okay, and then I can just have something like span. This content is spanned, like so. And let's just go ahead and open that up, right? And here's what I want you to notice. It doesn't look like anything, right? This content is spanned. However, if I do an inspect, I can see, yeah, there actually is. There is a span tag around that, okay? So a span tag basically is an inline tag that does wrap the particular content, but otherwise, for the most part, you're really not going to know it's there. Okay. On the other hand, oops. Here's a div, and notice this is in a div. So notice that that actually almost looks like it's in its own paragraph, right? That's because a div actually is a block level element as opposed to a span being an inline level element. Again, if you're one of these HTML5 geeks, you're probably going to send a comment to me of, well, technically there's not the, we don't really do those separations in HTML5. Yeah, I know, but it's convenient for this. And what I want to show you also is that, for instance, I could do after the div right here. Okay, so you'll notice that that a div, again, is some content, is a way of sort of wrapping some content, but does it in a sort of block level manner that kind of pulls it out from the rest of the paragraphs and so forth. On the other hand, spans are used for the content that is just inline. Okay, now why might I want to do this? Well, one example, like we saw before, where we had our links here, and I linked them directly to H1s and so forth. What if I wanted to link, say, to one of these? What if I wanted to link, say, to this here, Facereo Ficus, right? Well, then I could wrap that in a span, give it an ID, and then I could actually have a link for that particular phrase. I don't know why I'd want to do that, but I could. Again, as we start talking about things like styling and so forth, what you'll see, and in fact, when I mentioned before the idea that the HTML5 committee, when they were developing HTML5, looking for developer intent, this is actually what they were looking at. They were looking at the uses of spans and divs and how developers were using those to figure out what new tags to add. So for instance, the Nav Tag and so forth, right? That's how they basically did that. Okay, so again, and you'll see various uses online. You'll see them used in tutorials and so forth. A lot of times we end up having to wrap things in spans and divs to get around various quirky things in CSS and so forth. Okay, so a lot of information there. Lots of stuff on HTML, lots of stuff on Emmet. Hope you'll be able to stop the video, rewind, all of those kinds of things. Hopefully that helps. If you got any questions, again, you're in my class, hit me up on Piazza. Otherwise, if you found us on the web, shoot us a note in the comments.